In the mid-1950s, television was still finding its voice, and westerns were quickly becoming the genre of choice for American audiences. Among the dusty saloons and high-noon showdowns, one show would quietly reshape the image of a legendary lawman and launch a relatively unknown actor into unexpected stardom. That actor was Hugh O'Brian, and the role? Wyatt Earp. O'Brian wasn't the obvious pick for the part. Born Hugh Cramp in Rochester, New York, he had no deep Hollywood pedigree and certainly didn't have the rugged, worn-down look of a frontier marshal. In fact, before acting, he was one of the youngest drill instructors in the history of the Marine Corps. His military background gave him a quiet authority, and it's likely that sense of discipline and seriousness helped him land the role. Still, even then, no one quite expected what came next. When the life and legend of Wyatt Earp debuted in 1955, it was the first adult Western on television. While cowboy shows had existed before, this one broke the mold. It wasn't a kiddie adventure. It was trying to be grounded, gritty, and, at least on the surface, historical. O'Brien's portrayal was steely, deliberate, and almost eerily calm. He wore a flat-brimmed hat, walked with a deliberate slow stride, and rarely raised his voice. In a genre known for shootouts and saloon brawls, he brought something quieter and more dangerous. But even as O'Brian was winning over audiences, there was a strange tension behind the scenes. The version of Wyatt Earp he was bringing to life was based heavily on a 1931 biography by Stewart N. Lake, a book that had long been accused of fabricating much of Earp's story. Lake painted Earp as a flawless moral giant, a brave lawman who never backed down, never made mistakes, and never even shot first. In truth, the real Wyatt Earp was far more complicated and possibly far more controversial. O'Brian read Lake's book thoroughly. He didn't just play Earp, he studied him. He practiced quick draw skills relentlessly until he could outshoot most stuntmen. He tried to embody the myth, the legend, and the man. But the deeper he went, the more he seemed to understand there was something about Earp's story that didn't quite add up. Even then, he hinted in interviews that Earp wasn't perfect, and maybe that was a point. Still, audiences didn't care. O'Brian became a household name. He received bags of fan mail every week, especially from young boys who saw him as a moral compass. He played Earp for 6 seasons, turning the character into an icon for a generation that craved heroes. But as the cameras rolled and the scripts kept coming, something nagged at O'Brian. He had built his career portraying a version of a man who may never have really existed. And as whispers about the real Wyatt Earp grew louder, so did O'Brian's doubts. He wasn't just playing a lawman, he was shaping a legacy. And deep down, he knew that legacy wasn't as clean as it looked. By the time the life and legend of Wyatt Earp hit American television screens, the image of Wyatt Earp as a fearless, honorable frontier marshal was already firmly embedded in popular culture. But few people realized that this heroic portrayal wasn't based on hard historical fact. It was mostly the work of one man, Stewart N. Lake. Lake's 1931 biography, Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, was a runaway success. It was marketed as a definitive account of Earp's life, supposedly told with Earp's own blessing. But what Lake didn't say out loud was that much of the book was either exaggerated, reimagined, or outright fabricated. At the time, most Americans didn't care. They wanted a legend, not a flawed man. And Lake delivered. He turned Earp into a mythical figure, a clean-cut, gun-slinging lawman who never lost control, never took bribes, and supposedly never shot a man unless he was forced to. But the truth was far more complicated. Historians now believe that Lake only interviewed Earp briefly before his death, and that most of the content came from Earp's widow, Josephine, who was determined to protect her husband's reputation. She allegedly refused to allow anything into the book that hinted at Wyatt's rougher edges, his time running gambling halls, his brushes with the law, or his long-standing relationship with opium-addicted prostitute Mattie Blaylock, who died under mysterious circumstances. The Wyatt Earp in Lake's book was a sanitized, near-saintly figure. The real man was something else entirely, and Hugh O'Brian knew it. Though he worked closely with Lake's material while preparing for the TV role, O'Brian quickly realized that the biography was more legend than history. He once admitted in interviews that he believed Wyatt Earp had had faults, and even hinted that portraying him as perfect was dangerous for young viewers. But the show had its formula. The producers wanted a clear-cut hero. There wasn't much room for moral ambiguity in prime-time westerns during the 1950s. Still, O'Brian tried to inject subtle layers into his performance. If you watch closely, there are moments where his Wyatt Earp hesitates, where his eyes betray doubt or internal conflict. O'Brian seemed to be playing two characters at once. The myth America wanted, and the flawed man he suspected was buried beneath the polished legend. Behind the scenes, however, the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Historians were beginning to push back against Lake's version. Research was uncovering legal troubles, suspicious killings, and inconsistent accounts of Earp's behavior. The more people dug, the less heroic he looked. But the show pressed on. Audiences still wanted their clean, black-and-white Western. For O'Brian, the dissonance must have been growing. He was portraying a man who had become a symbol of law and order, when in reality, Earp may have operated in that moral gray area where justice and survival blurred. And while Hugh couldn't say everything he knew on air, his performance often hinted at it. He may have smiled like a hero, but behind that smile was a man who knew the truth wasn't quite so simple. While Hugh O'Brian helped cement Wyatt Earp as a symbol of justice, the truth behind a man was anything but clean-cut. Beneath the shiny badge and Hollywood polish lay a web of controversy, violence, and ethically murky choices that most Americans never heard about. And what's more chilling, O'Brian likely knew all of it, but couldn't speak openly without shattering the myth he'd helped build. Let's start with Earp's first common-law wife, Mattie Blaylock. Far from the picture-perfect frontier couple, their relationship was haunted by addiction and neglect. Mattie, believed to be addicted to laudanum, a powerful opiate, was essentially abandoned by Earp when he left her for Josephine Marcus, a former actress and possibly a courtesan. Not long after, Mattie died from what was reported as a self-inflicted overdose. The details surrounding her death have remained suspiciously vague, and while Earp was never officially linked to any wrongdoing, his abrupt disappearance from her life painted a cold picture. Then there's Earp's career before he wore a badge. He was arrested multiple times in his early years, for everything from horse theft to involvement in illegal gambling rings. One arrest in Arkansas involved him being jailed for allegedly stealing a horse, only to escape before trial. Later, he bounced between towns, often finding work as a bouncer or enforcer at saloons and brothels. Hardly the resume of a squeaky clean lawman. These episodes were all but erased from the public image crafted by Stuart Lake and the TV show that followed. Even Earp's most famous moment, the gunfight at the OK Corral, wasn't as heroic as it's often portrayed. Far from a noble stand against evil, the shootout was part of an escalating feud between rival factions in Tombstone, Arizona. Earp and his brothers, along with Doc Holliday, ambushed the Clan McLaury gang after days of threats and tension. 3 men were killed in a matter of seconds, and though Earp came out on top, many in the town believed it had been a calculated execution, not self-defense. Later, during the Earp vendetta ride, Wyatt led a posse that tracked down and killed several men suspected of attacking his brother Virgil and murdering his brother Morgan. These killings weren't sanctioned by law. They were vigilante acts. Earp was never tried, but he fled Arizona territory, never to return. To some, he was a hero. To others, a killer who used his badge to settle personal scores. Hugh O'Brian was well aware of these stories. He studied Earp extensively, and by the 1960s, these buried facts were beginning to resurface. While the TV show glossed over them, O'Brian occasionally dropped subtle hints in interviews, suggesting that the man behind the legend was far more human and far more flawed than the role he portrayed. But publicly, the darker truths stayed in the shadows. The network wanted a hero, the sponsors wanted stability, and audiences wanted a figure they could believe in. Still, for those paying attention, the cracks in the legend were already beginning to show. And Hugh O'Brian, he was right there, straddling the line between truth and fiction, knowing that the real Wyatt Earp wasn't just complicated, he was dangerous. As the life and legend of Wyatt Earp climbed the ratings, Hugh O'Brian wasn't just delivering lines. He was quietly doing homework no one asked of him. Unlike many actors who rely solely on scripts, O'Brian immersed himself in the world behind the scenes. He studied, investigated, and most critically, he asked questions. A lot of them. And the answers he uncovered, they weren't the ones America was ready to hear. Hugh had access most people didn't. He spoke with surviving family members of Earp's contemporaries, poured through dusty archives, and reached out to early Western historians who were already poking holes in Stuart Lake's account. Over the years, his fascination with the real Wyatt Earp became something of a private mission. In one interview decades later, O'Brian admitted that he was haunted by Earp's contradictions. How a man could be both a lawman and an outlaw, a protector and an executioner. And what's more, Hugh had conversations with Stuart Lake himself. According to those close to him, O'Brian grew increasingly uncomfortable with how tightly the TV series clung to Lake's version of events. In private, Lake reportedly acknowledged that many parts of his book were embellished. He even admitted he had to omit stories at the request of Josephine Marcus Earp, Wyatt's widow, who was obsessed with scrubbing any whiff of scandal from her late husband's reputation. She had allegedly threatened legal action if any of Earp's unsavory past was revealed. O'Brian understood the stakes. He knew his performance would shape how millions saw Wyatt Earp for generations. But behind his cool, composed screen presence, he was wrestling with a moral dilemma. Was he part of something noble, or was he helping to preserve a lie? This internal conflict bled into his performance over time. In later seasons, O'Brian's portrayal of Earp grew colder, more stoic. He began playing a role with a sense of weight, less like a hero and more like a man carrying the burden of impossible expectations. Watch closely and you'll see it. The glances that lingered too long, the pauses before delivering judgment. They weren't just for dramatic flair. O'Brian was telling a deeper story, without ever saying a word. There were even rumors that he pushed for episodes that would show Earp's flaws, his recklessness, his impatience with due process. But the network declined. Sponsors feared any dent in the sheriff's halo might turn off audiences. So instead, O'Brian played a quiet game, threading truth between the lines of a scripted legend. Years later, he would admit he believed Wyatt Earp was a man of contradictions, and hinted that if given a chance, he had told a different version of the story, one closer to the truth. But back then, TV wasn't ready. The myth was too profitable. Still, Hugh O'Brian knew what most viewers didn't. Behind the badge was a man shaped by violence, shadowed by controversy, and shielded by decades of carefully crafted fiction. And he carried that truth with him, silently, respectfully, but never blindly. For decades, Hugh O'Brian played the part, not just on screen, but in public. He answered interview questions with diplomacy, deflected controversy, and protected the image of Wyatt Earp that millions had grown up admiring. But behind closed doors, the truth weighed on him, and eventually he decided it was time to speak. Carefully but clearly. It didn't happen in a dramatic press conference or splashy magazine expose. O'Brian wasn't looking for attention. Instead, he began breaking his silence slowly during low-key interviews and public talks in the late 1980s and 90s. By then, the world had changed. Audiences were more open to morally complex stories. Westerns had taken a darker turn, thanks to films like Unforgiven and Tombstone. People no longer wanted perfect heroes. They wanted the truth. In one interview with a regional news station, O'Brian was asked if he believed Wyatt Earp was truly the flawless lawman portrayed on TV. His response was quiet but deliberate. "No man is without flaws," he said. And Wyatt Earp was no exception. That one sentence, seemingly harmless, was a major shift. For the first time, the man who had once embodied the legend was publicly stepping away from it. Later, in a speaking engagement at a Western Film Festival, O'Brian went further. He explained that Earp's life walked the line between law and survival, and that he made decisions most people wouldn't understand today. He stopped short of naming specific incidents, but the message was clear. The real Wyatt Earp was not the man America had been sold. What makes this even more impactful is the timing. O'Brian didn't need to speak up. He was already retired from a role respected by fans and revered in Western circles. But something inside him needed to set the record straight, at least partially. "We owe it to history," he once said, "to be honest about the people we turn into icons." And it wasn't just Earp he was reflecting on, it was himself. O'Brian admitted that playing Earp shaped his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was invited to speak at law enforcement events, treated like a symbol of justice, even though he was just an actor playing a role. It bothered him. "People treated me like I was Wyatt Earp," he said, "but I always knew better." There's a haunting honesty in how he phrased that. He wasn't bitter, just aware that myths, once told, take on a life of their own, and that sometimes the people who carry those myths, like O'Brian, become trapped inside them. Still, his decision to break the silence gave fans something rare, a fuller picture. Not just of Wyatt Earp, but of Hugh O'Brian himself, a man who spent years portraying a legend, only to discover that the truth, as messy as it was, mattered more than the myth. And in doing so, O'Brian didn't tarnish Earp's legacy. He added depth to it, because sometimes it's not the perfect heroes who inspire us most, but the flawed ones who still try to do what was right. Decades after the life and legend of Wyatt Earp first aired, and long after Hugh O'Brian hung up his TV marshal's badge, the myth of Wyatt Earp still lingers. Tourists still visit Tombstone. Books are still written. Films are still made. And in many ways, the version of Earp that Hugh O'Brian helped popularize continues to shape public perception. But now, it exists alongside something deeper. The cracks in the story that reveal the man behind the myth. And it's those cracks that Hugh O'Brian came to respect most. By the time he passed away in 2016, O'Brian had fully embraced the complexities of Earp's life. He no longer saw the need to defend the legend or cover up the darker chapters. In fact, he seemed to admire the real Wyatt Earp more than the polished version he portrayed. Because Earp was real, messy, flawed, human, and that's what made him interesting. As O'Brian aged, he often spoke about legacy, not just Earp's but his own. Despite starring in a hit show that defined a generation of Westerns, he never allowed it to define him. He founded the Hugh O'Brian Youth Leadership Hobie Foundation in 1958, after spending 9 inspirational days with Dr. Albert Schweitzer in Africa. That experience sparked something in him, something far removed from gunslinging and frontier justice. He wanted to help shape leaders who could think critically, challenge myths, and inspire change. In a way, it was the ultimate rebuttal to the very role that had made him famous. But his connection to Wyatt Earp never faded. Fans never stopped asking about the show. Tombstone still honored him, and Western conventions treated him like royalty. Yet behind the handshakes and photo ops, there was always a quiet understanding, especially in his later years, that the story he told on TV wasn't the whole truth. And he was okay with that, because he knew that real legacies aren't about perfection. They're about influence. Earp's influence stretched far beyond the dusty streets of 19th century Arizona. He became a symbol of American justice, not because he was just, but because people needed him to be. That need created a story, and that story became legend. Hugh O'Brian, knowingly or not, became its messenger. But unlike many actors, he didn't cling to the fantasy. He evolved with it. In the end, what remains is this. Wyatt Earp was both more and less than the hero we imagined. And Hugh O'Brian, by slowly peeling back the curtain, gave us permission to see both sides. The courage and the contradiction. The lawman and the outlaw. The legend and the lie. It's rare for an actor to outgrow the role that made him. Rarer still to confront it. But Hugh O'Brian did both. With grace, with humility, and with a quiet determination to tell the truth when it mattered most. And maybe that's the real story worth remembering.